What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to an episode of the VO2 Max podcast. In today's episode, it was a little bit different than what I normally do. It's normally either myself talking or myself with just one other guest, but we had two guests on the show in this episode. And today's episode was all about attentional focus and cueing. And this topic was something that I had always been kind of interested in because how you, especially as a coach, how you cue athletes and what you have them focus on while not only training but also performing is important. And having them focus on things internal to themselves versus external to themselves creates different outcomes. And those outcomes are important, especially if you're trying to perform your best. And that's what we really dive into in this episode. So we had Dr. Ron Snarr back on the podcast. And for those of you who have listened to previous episodes, he was on an episode in which we talked about high intensity interval training. He had a graduate student who recently graduated and got his master's degree from Georgia Southern University. His name is Connor. And his entire thesis was on attentional focus and cueing, specifically for the bench press exercise. And so in today's episode, we're going to talk about his thesis and then how those findings, as well as just what the broader research literature in general, as it relates to attentional focus and cueing, tells us about maybe some of the cues that we should be using during different circumstances, such as like training versus racing and competing. So I really got a lot out of this episode. I think there's a lot in here for not only coaches, but also the self-coached endurance athletes themselves. And yeah, I had a lot of fun with this. It's a topic that I'm really interested in as an athlete and a coach. And so I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. All right, cool. So let's hop right in. So a little bit different today. I got two guests on the call. One of them is not new to the podcast. He was on an episode on high intensity interval training. So we have Dr. Ron Snarr back. And then we also have now on this episode, Collum, who is a recent graduate of Georgia Southern University with his master's degree. So just in case there's some listeners on here who haven't or who weren't introduced to you, Ron, I'll let you go ahead and just give a brief background just to orient the listeners to who you are.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So like Ryan said, I'm Dr. Ron Snarr. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia Southern University, and a lot of my work is in exercise physiology, whether that's at the sport level or general pop or even clinical level. So a lot of what I do is research-based interventions, whether that's high-intensity interval training, looking at instability, firefighters, police officers, occupational performance. You name it, I probably have my hands in it. But so it's just general X-Phys is kind of my background.
Yeah, cool. And then Connor, go ahead and just give a brief background as to who you are as well.
Yeah, my name is Collum. I just graduated from Georgia Southern with my master's in exercise science. Also completed my bachelor's with them as well. Primary research interests are mainly around resistance training. However, I've helped Dr. Snarr with everything from body composition to lactate threshold and stuff like that.
Yeah, cool. And so are you planning on getting like furthering your education with a PhD, or are you getting a job out in the field?
Job first, PhD later. Big thing right now is just kind of it's a want, but the just the timing of things right now. The past 2 years have been a trip. So
yeah. So how was it getting the master's for you? I remember there were some points when I was getting my master's where I was like, holy crap.
Well, yeah, like first year kind of hits you in the mouth just because it's to a degree that you've never experienced before. And then second year, obviously you're a lot more acclimated to that stress, but you just got more on your plate. Thesis is a lot of work. It's from research design to recruiting participants and then scheduling the data collections and then writing everything up. It's an extremely long process. So just very time consuming.
Yeah. And you actually we're going to talk about your thesis here in a sec, but you actually worked with people in person. I remember for my thesis, mine was a national study and it was completely remote. And so at least from like the sense of meeting people in person and doing data collection in person, I didn't have any of that burden. So that It made my thesis a little bit easier, but yeah, I could imagine with your thesis, with all the different things you had going on and having to, schedule appointments and do all the data collection in person. It was probably pretty laborious, I would imagine. So today's episode is focused on attentional focus and cueing and how that relates to endurance athletes specifically is what we're going to eventually get into. But we're going to talk about your thesis here first, Connor. But just before we get into what your thesis actually was and what some of your findings were, let's just orient the listeners to just some basic definitions around attentional focus and cueing. So whoever wants to tackle it, or if you guys both want to tackle the question, that's fine. But just give some brief definitions as to what attentional focus is and cueing and kind of how you use them in the field of strength and conditioning.
Yeah, so I'll briefly go over cueing first. Cues are typically used to either correct or teach an exercise or a task. Since we're talking about athletes, we'll go with exercise, but or just reinforce it later on, whether they're in a competition or something like that. Now, cues can be neutral in terms of just do the best you can, or they can make use of something called attentional focus, which is basically driving that concentration to focus on a specific muscle group, a joint movement, the outcome of whatever you're trying to do, or just a focal point, like a cone or a line or some arbitrary landmark.
Right.
But then, we can break that attentional focus down into different methodologies. So mainly you have internal and external, and it stops there usually. And an internal cue will make use of a landmark within the athlete's body, whether that be a muscle or a joint or something like that. So an example would be, use the muscles of your leg to jump as high as you can. Mm-hmm. Or if we're, in a resistance training scenario, it's really common with bodybuilders to, focus on a specific muscle group for the mind-muscle connection. Mm-hmm. So, if you're doing a curl, you're focusing on the biceps. Mm-hmm. You're not thinking of all the smaller muscle groups at work.
Right.
But then, that can be subdivided into broad and narrow. So if we're thinking about something like just the muscles of the leg in general, or if I just want you to rapidly, extend your knee and I want you to focus on your quadriceps. So that can be, divided even further. For external, we're typically using some kind of landmark outside of the body. So whether that be a ball or, if we're looking at baseball, use the bat, or if we're golf, we use the club. And then that can also be, again, subdivided into proximal and distal. Mm-hmm. So I'll use golf as an example. If we're in a golf swing, you can focus on that club head, or you can focus on the flight path of the ball, the flight path that you want. So proximal being the club head, and then distal being the actual flight path of the ball.
Right.
And then to kind of adopt something from Dr. Winkleman, who does a ton of research in attentional focus. He actually just came out with a book on it. He breaks down cueing as being comprised of three things, and that being distance, so proximal and distal, mm-hmm. direction, so toward, away, up, down, mm-hmm. and then a description. And that description typically makes use of, an action word like drive or explode, something like that, the buzzword to get the attention of the athlete, and then you follow that with what you actually want them to do.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like it can get a little complex because there's a lot of different ways of subdividing down the types of cues and what you're having them focus on, and the different direction and distance and those types of things, like you said. And obviously when we get into your thesis, we'll kind of talk about some of the specific cues that you use with bench press is what you focused on. And then later on, we'll give some examples that might be more relevant to endurance athletes. But before we go into your thesis again, let's just go over, because one of your outcomes was looking at EMG in your study. So really, really quick, just and maybe Ron, if you want to tackle this one, because I know you're the expert when it comes to EMG. Just kind of briefly define that and what it's used for in research.
Yeah, no problem. I know enough to be dangerous. I'm going to consider myself an expert. So EMG, also known as electromyography, you have to think about how do we quantify how hard, in a sense, a muscle is working. So what we do for like cardiac muscle is an EKG, right? So we always hear about putting in electrodes on your chest and looking to see what the patterns is of an EKG. Well, EMG is literally the same thing, but you're using skeletal muscle mass instead of cardiac muscle. So we want to see how hard, in a sense, a muscle is working or what it's doing. We look at EMG, the electrical activity that's given off by the muscle. One of the ways we quantify that is putting some electrodes on your skin, over a given muscle group, whatever that may be, and, have you perform an exercise or look at different variations of an exercise to see how many motor units we're actually activating. And so a motor unit, if we're unfamiliar with that, it's basically a nerve, and that nerve innervates or touches a bunch of muscle fibers, right? And when that nerve is excited or activated, in a sense, whatever fibers that touches, well, those fibers are going to do something in terms of contraction-wise, right? So the more motor units we activate or kind of innervate or whatever you want to call it to do a given job means that the muscle is working, in a sense, harder to do a given job, right? So if we go with the bicep curl example, 5 pounds for an average person is pretty lightweight, right? So when we curl bicep, do a bicep curl of 5 pounds, we're not really activating that many muscle fibers. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a little bit of activity coming out. We're going to see a little bit. Now, if we up that to 10 pounds, well, that motor unit excitation that we see, or the EMG signal or the electrical activity, is going to increase. Right? It's not going to double. It's not like 5 pounds is double the amount for the motor activity there, but we'll see some sort of linear increase as we keep going up in weight. So basically, if you lifted 1 RM, right, we picked up a dumbbell as high as we can go for one bicep curl, that should be the max amount of muscle we can use, in a sense. So what we do with EMG is we look at different exercises to say, okay, for this individual, this exercise was harder than this other one, right? And so we can do all types of variations. So a dumbbell bench press versus a barbell bench press versus a chest press, right? So barbell bench press, we're, say, pressing 100 pounds. Well, if we look at a dumbbell bench press, same load of 100 pounds, does that actually recruit more or less muscle mass? Well, it turns out it's going to recruit more because we're doing more things. We have that stability role. We're doing more jobs for that muscle. So it is actually harder for the muscle to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's why when we go from barbells to dumbbells, we actually use a lighter load and things like that because it's harder to do it at an absolute load. So EMG is basically a simple way to quantify what the muscle is doing during any given task. And it's used from clinical pops all the way up to sport performance. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. So just a way of essentially measuring the activity of a muscle. And
in a sense, yeah, right.
Right.
So it's not a measure of strength. It's not a measure of force. So I can't tell who's stronger, right, by how much motor units you're recruiting. Just as how much work that muscle is doing for that given job. That's it.
Right. Okay. So now getting into your thesis, Connor, you were looking at bench press repetitions to failure with a variety of different cueing approaches. And so you were looking at essentially the differences in motor unit activity or through EMG, as well as the amount of repetitions that they could perform to failure. Is that right?
Yep.
So just briefly go over. So just kind of briefly go over then just your study in general, like the kind of participants you enrolled and just the general methods, and then we'll get into the findings a little bit after.
Yeah, so we recruited from Georgia Southern University through email, but most of the students ended up being exercise science students. For the inclusion criteria, they were required to currently be resistant training and be resistant training for the past 6 months, just because we don't want any adaptations to occur during that data collection and then that alter subsequent results.
Right.
So they had to be training for at least 6 months. They had to currently be resistance training, currently performing the bench press, being familiar with it. And then if they, cleared of any contraindications, stuff like that with exercise. The first day they came in, we ran some basic demographic data, just height, weight, body composition. And then they performed a 1 repetition maximum on the bench just because I wanted a value, I didn't want a self-reported value. Mm-hmm. So we did that, and then that also gave us a chance to introduce the cadence that they would be under, because another thing with EMG is if I have somebody on a bench press just violently, throwing it around, that EMG reading is going to be off the charts. It's going to be spiked just because of the velocity of the bar.
Right.
Of them throwing it around. So participants were required to make use of a cadence that was enforced through a metronome that I had playing through each data collection. We had them do a 2-second eccentric, a 1-second pause at the chest, 1 second back up, and then a 1 second hold at the top. Once we got done with the 1 RM, they were free to go for day 1. Mm-hmm. And then days 2 through 4 were randomized using a random number generator. And then basically the design for those next 3 days was we had their whatever their cue was, so whatever their attentional focus was randomized, and then they came in and we did 2 warm-up sets at 50% and 65% of their 1 RM, and then they had their set to failure at 85%. And then with the EMG prior to this, they were hooked up to the electrodes, which were placed at the anterior deltoid, pectoralis major, and then triceps brachii.
Yeah. So what were the 3 different cues? I know you had 1 internal and then 2 different external cues, a proximal and a distal, right?
Yeah. So the internal cue was they were instructed to drive the weight with their chest, to focus on their chest throughout the movement. Right. And they were cued for all 3 sets. Okay. So by the time we got to that working set, that those words were already in their head, but then they were also given to them every other repetition. Okay. So every 2 repetitions, either me or another researcher that was in the lab with me gave them that cue, and then that stayed consistent across conditions. But yeah, that was the internal, and then the external proximal cue actually made use of we had a meter stick, and I had someone be behind them like they were spotting them. We had spotters on the sides, and that person standing, above them was holding that meter stick out. So it was basically about, I don't know, 1/2 inch or 1 inch away from where they were fully locked out. Mm-hmm. So every repetition they were driving towards that ruler. But then obviously they weren't allowed to hit it because that causes, disturbances. But then the external distal cue was basically just the ceiling. They were just told to drive towards the ceiling. Okay. And then you had some, it's anecdotal, but I had some people say, they picked, one little spot in the ceiling, and you had some people that they just focused on it broad and just went for it. So.
Gotcha. Right. And then the two main outcomes was EMG activity and then the number of repetitions to failure they could do at 85% of their 1 RM, right?
Yeah.
So we obviously don't have to go into every single finding, but probably some of the bigger ones. And I guess it's the differences that you notice between the internal cueing versus the external cueing, more specifically the external distal cueing, right? So just kind of touch on some of those findings.
Yeah. So for repetitions to failure, there was on average 1 more repetition performed with the external distal cue than the internal cue. External proximal kind of fell straight in the middle, but it was closer to the internal cue. Mm-hmm. I think it was more or less 6 and 5. I have the actual means right here, but.
And I think the big thing with the reps to fatigue that we did 85%, which according to NSCA is around 6 reps.
Yeah.
right? For the guidelines, that's how much the average person should get at 85%. But the individual variation that we saw within each group, we had a pretty big range. So not everybody hit 6. We had some that hit what, Connor, 2 or 3, and then some that hit 14.
Yeah, it was 2 to 14 with external distal.
Wow. Wow. So more reps, right, with external, less with internal. And then with internal, you saw more EMG activity, right? So it's in essence, recruiting more motor units.
For the chest, yeah. So
okay.
For the pectoralis major, there was about a 7 to 10% increase between, like, compared to the 2 external methods.
Mm-hmm.
But when we looked at deltoid and triceps, they were all more or less in the same. There wasn't a huge difference between those. But then we also looked at RPE, and RPE was the same across all conditions. So even though with the external distal condition, they were performing like a whole nother rep on average,
right,
that RPE didn't change.
Huh. Yeah. And it's interesting. What I thought was the most interesting was that, most people might intuitively think that, okay, well, if you're recruiting more of your muscle, you might be able to do more repetitions, right? But it's kind of interesting that you found the opposite of that, right? Like almost less motor unit recruitment, especially for the external distal, resulted in on average like an extra rep. So what do you think are like some of the main implications or findings, like some of the conclusions from this?
Well, I think the main implication kind of takes off what you just said. The fact that, you have that increased motor unit excitation and you think that would make you perform more reps, but the fact that you're at that heightened state increases the onset of that fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're performing at a higher level with one variable, but that's going to be a decrement to other variables, like whatever your performance variable is for this reps to fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's a big finding. But then also just the fact that no matter what they were told, the internal load didn't change.
Yeah.
At all, referencing RPE.
Right.
So there's that. But then another thing that I thought was interesting is it's not really huge with the practical application side, but just the fact that among these cues, the only muscle group that increased in motor unit excitation was the pec major. The other 2 did not change. So there wasn't, and I mean, that's been validated by a couple other studies that we've looked at, but then there was no, sign of compensation from other muscle groups. There was no picking up slack, even though, they were performing another rep.
Right. Yeah. So, and it's almost like, I guess the way that I kind of thought about it when I first read it was you want to recruit as many motor units as possible, but only like the amount that's completely necessary to do the task well and efficiently, right? Like you don't want to just be recruiting more than you need, because then it's going to result in undue fatigue at a quicker rate.
The only scenario that, you want more motor unit excitation would be, hypertrophy, bodybuilding, that kind of thing. And that goes back to that whole mind muscle thing that's been around since, Arnold Schwarzenegger was competing at the Olympia.
Yeah. And I remember seeing that in your conclusions too. That was like one specific example you gave in which like maybe the external cues doesn't matter as much if your goal is to, improve muscle size or mass through hypertrophy. Like you want the most amount of motor units recruited that you possibly can.
Yeah, because
you don't care about reps, right?
Yeah, in that scenario, you're not. That is your performance variable. Right. Is the size. You're not worried about how many reps you can perform or how high you can jump or how fast you are. That's what you're concerned with. So if that's what you're concerned with, then yeah, by all means use it, because it's been shown to increase.
Yeah. So, and bodybuilding is a little bit different than most sports in which like the outcome isn't internal, right? It's like external, like what you do, how you physically perform. And so, in the case of endurance sport, for example, it's how fast can you go, but how fast can you go with like the least amount of energy and effort as possible.
Exactly.
So now kind of starting to tie some of this stuff over to endurance sport a little bit. And I haven't necessarily looked at a ton of the literature when it comes to like cueing in endurance athletes, but I know I've seen a little bit that kind of relates to what you've done here and what you've shown here, in the sense that it's really, really common for a lot of coaches, like running coaches, say, to cue athletes to, when they're feeling tired or fatigued at the end of a race, to focus on like their cadence or like their breathing rate. And at least in my experience, I've seen a lot more internal cueing being thrown around from coaches as opposed to like external cueing. But I know I've seen a little bit of research that's shown, and I can't remember the specifics because it's been so long, but essentially it shows that external cueing tends to lower heart rate and RPE at the same given kind of speed, pace, power output, whatever you want to use to measure it, when compared to internal cueing. So do you think, obviously these findings are specifically for the bench press, but do you think that this same kind of concept holds true for endurance sport, maybe, where external cueing is what you might want if your goal is to like maximize your performance?
I mean, based on the probably 100 studies I read, getting ready for all this, the overwhelming consensus is that no matter what sport we're in, typically an external focus is going to increase whatever the performance outcome is. Mm-hmm. And that's been typically related back to Dr. Wolf and the constrained action hypothesis, which is basically like, if we're saying, so like, let's say we take, a marathon runner and they're focusing on their gait, and they're, consciously thinking about every step. That's going to increase their ability to make a mistake. Mm-hmm. And basically what it is you're adding a conscious task by thinking about the next step, instead of just letting, your skill and everything auto-regulate and just perform the movement.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of that, self-regulation. So running, walking, especially for people who run all the time, like a marathon runner, or they're used to this repetitive task of running. Well, things like that, walking and running and jogging and, cycling, become almost a spinal reflex in a sense, right? It's called spinal automaticity. And so when we walk somewhere, we don't think about walking, right? We don't think about every step we take, and we jog all the time. We don't think about all those steps. It becomes almost sort of a reflex. We can think about whatever we want during that time. But once you start to focus on the actual act of it, right? It's like you walking down the street and then you notice somebody watching you walk. You get all jumbled and you're like, am I walking weird? Now my walk changes and all that stuff. And so now everything changes. Right. And so when a runner during a race is thinking about my gait pattern, now I overthink everything. And now once I start to overthink everything, my energy cost has gone up. Right. Because the whole point of endurance, especially for a long distance run, is to maintain a given intensity, but also keep that intensity kind of low at a given speed. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't want to do, a higher economy than I need to. I don't want to burn more calories than I need to when I'm running, right? I want to keep that lowest, energy demand possible, that lowest percent possible that I can of energy demand. So once I start to overthink and overactivate these muscles, that's energy. That's going to be more energy down the line, right? So I'm going to lead to earlier fatigue down that line, even if it's small pieces, but it's increments. That's going to build up, right? You got 26 miles to run. That's going to build up pretty quick as I start to over-recruit muscles a little bit at a time. Right. So the external distal cue that we used in the bench press study, you could think of that as your normal movement. I'm not thinking about it. There's nothing to do with over recruitment. Right. And so once I start to think about internal cue, right, the work, press the barbell with my chest, now I'm over activating, which leads to that early fatigue, that one less rep. Right. Even at a high intensity, I did one less rep. Right. That's where we start to change economy, change fatigue rates, change everything. So for the endurance athlete, minimizing as much focus on the internal environment, especially the leg muscles, right? Or whatever you're doing at the time, swimming versus arm muscles, right? Leg muscles for running. But as soon as you start to think about that internal thing, or think about the pain, or think about, oh God, this hurts and all that stuff, that RPE, how hard you're working, how you feel is going to start to build up very quick. which is going to lead to negative thought, emotion, all that stuff, right? And lead to, increased energy demand.
Right. So I guess for the endurance athlete or any athlete really, just using running still as an example. So, the last couple miles of a marathon, you're really fatigued. Rather than focusing on what you're doing with your gait or your breathing, it might be best to focus on something that's like out in the external environment, like, something in the distance, right? Like comparable to like focusing on the ceiling for bench press. Maybe you're focusing on like a turn that's coming up, a quarter mile down the road that you can see.
Let me just make it to that part, right? Let me just make it to that part. Then once I get to that part, okay, where's the next part I need to make it to? Let me just make it to that part.
Right.
And I mean, and even if that's, if you have somebody that's overthinking the cueing process, based on previous studies, having, no attentional focus at all and just not thinking, being absent-minded is typically better than having an internal focus.
Right. So just not thinking about anything, just letting your body do its thing without trying to interrupt it.
That's
more or less.
Yeah. So I guess though, one area where internal cueing might be important would be when trying to master or hone in a specific skill, especially if it's like a complex task, like say working on your swim technique, or working on something very specific to your running gait or running mechanics. So would that be one example where internal cueing might be more beneficial than obviously focusing on external cueing?
Well, yeah. One thing that we talk about is having, the relationship between a novice and an expert, or somebody, not even necessarily a novice, but somebody learning a new task. Because with exercise, it's a movement that, especially if somebody's never done before, it's going to be foreign. So despite, how you're going to cue them, if you cue them externally, they can still perform it wrong, because for the most part, an external cue relies on you already knowing how to perform the movement. And what Dr. Snarr was talking about, you doing it basically absent-minded and just performing it. But if they don't know how to do that and they've never learned, they don't have that relation. So I think especially, again, what we talk about with my study, because it was resistance training, is people that have never, touched a weight before. They don't know where they're supposed to feel something. They don't know where they're supposed to feel a contraction, or, hey, I'm doing a lat pull down and my left pec's contracting. Well, there's an issue somewhere.
Right.
So just, using, the internal strategies at first to say, hey, you're supposed to feel this here, or, this is what I want you to extend or flex, whatever, and move on from there.
Right. And
the cue leads to feedback, right? Like Connor was saying. So when I give you the cue of the lat pull down, you should feel it in your back. Well, if I don't feel it in my back, well, that's the feedback. Okay, maybe I need to change. Maybe I got to tell. So when a coach is giving, that athlete, the new athlete, this is how you want to feel, or you should feel it here or here or here. And if they're not, that's the feedback given to the coach to now change the cue if he needs to. Maybe, or alter technique, or maybe even regress to a different exercise. Okay, we're not getting that yet. Let's change this first.
Yeah. So like, I guess if a swimmer, let's say a swimmer's hand entry is like way out wide, when in reality, in general, a swimmer's hand entry should be somewhere in line with their shoulders. And let's just say the coach is asking the swimmer, hey, do you feel like your hand is entering out in front of your shoulder? And they're like, oh yeah, but it's entering way out here. Obviously they don't have like the mind muscle connection between where their hand actually is entering and where it should be entering, right? So in that case, external cueing might not work if you're trying to get them to correct that specific movement pattern. Then you might need to shift more to the internal cueing and get them to like focus on something internal to themselves to feel where their hand is entering.
And that's where a lot of biofeedback comes for, or video feedback, or the coaching techniques to say like, here's the cue, but you're still doing this incorrectly. Here's the other feedback that we need, right? So it's a multifactorial approach. So it's not like I can just give somebody a cue and expect them to miraculously do this without other feedback too. And then there's the sense of too much cueing, too much feedback.
Right.
How many cues and how to word it and all that stuff. That's a whole different ballgame too.
Yeah. So with the cueing, it's almost like, there's not one type of cue that's best. It's you have to kind of think of everything in the context of like, A, what are you trying to accomplish? And B, where is this athlete in terms of like their ability, like have they mastered the skill or have they not mastered the skill? So there's obviously a lot of different things to take into account, each from like a coaching perspective.
Yeah. And I mean, also there's the fact that, everybody's an individual. Mm-hmm. So, a cue that I give you may not work for Dr. Snarr. And there's also, that's going to be up to the coach. Mm-hmm. You could give an entire team a cue and half of them don't respond to it. Mm-hmm. So there's also, an individual relationship that has to be there.
Yeah. No, and that's true. I'm glad you mentioned that too, because especially with, we work with a lot of swimmers, and swimming is just so complex, and we work with a lot of people who just never swam growing up. And so obviously not swimming growing up, it's quite a shift to learn how to swim when you're already an adult. It's pretty awful. And yeah, it's so true, because one cue might work for one adult who's learning how to swim, but for another one, it's, that cue just, they never register with it. So it's just, different cues for different people.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm curious though, did you guys look at any literature that was related to cueing and endurance athletes specifically, or was most of it in strength training?
Most of it, when we do look at endurance, like you said earlier, Ryan, like heart rate changes or, other things like RPE changes in the endurance athlete. So with like thinking about leg muscles and the endurance athlete, that's not what should be the focus. So it hasn't really been studied in terms of like the EMG response, mm-hmm. right? Because telling an athlete that's running 20 some miles to say, hey, focus on your leg all the time, we know that goes up in activity. That'd be the worst possible thing to do. That's going to increase. So, they'll tell them like, look at gait patterns and blah, blah, blah. But VO2, right? Your metabolic demand when you're running, how much energy you're expending. That's one of the biggest things, because like I said earlier, if you can get away with this speed, this constant speed that you're going at, right below your threshold, your lactate threshold or whatever, and if you can get away with that energy demand for that whole race, that's perfect. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you start to think about those gait patterns, exhaustion starts to step in. You might have crossed now the metabolic demand over that threshold. Right? Mm-hmm. You may have changed your gait pattern to now go a little bit faster, and now you've just all of a sudden crossed the threshold by going 0.1, miles per hour faster. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to change running economy, which is huge for a long distance race. And so changing that running economy by thinking about an internal cue, that's going to maybe the difference between winning and losing, right? And so the fatigue starts to set in as soon as you start thinking about all these little changes. They've done some studies with muscular endurance, a lot of muscular endurance stuff, and internal cues lead to a faster time to fatigue, right? They wear out faster. They just do. Other things, VO2 max, the metabolic demand of doing something doesn't really change if your running pattern and economy hasn't changed, but heart rate can. Right? Yeah. As soon as you start to think about these internal things, pain, how fast you're going and all these things, heart rate may spike due to multi-factors like anxiety level or some sort of psychological response. Then now heart rate is going up. Well, when heart rate goes up, guess what happens to metabolic demand? That goes up as well. And so now you're fatiguing even faster because of something that has nothing to do with a cue that you gave the runner. So Connor might have some different ones than I did. So
No, you basically wrapped it up. I just think it's the biggest thing when you're thinking about just internal cues in general is if you focus on it, it's going to increase. So if I'm thinking about my heart rate's going to go up. Mm-hmm. Or if I'm thinking about, how much the burning in my legs, how much that hurts, my legs are going to start to hurt more. Mm-hmm. That's just basically what the overwhelming consensus is.
Yeah. You almost want to like dissociate from what your body is physically doing.
Exactly.
At least from the sense of like trying to perform maximally and maximize your economy or efficiency while moving yourself through space and time.
Yeah.
It's about like just disassociating from what you're doing and focusing on something outside of you to be as economical as possible.
For sure. And a lot of the literature uses those terms like, dissociate or associate and what you're doing. And so the dissociate cues work a lot better than the associating cues of pain or, even breathing. Some runners can get away with it and focus on the breathing, and that changes. It kind of just clears the mind and focus on one thing at a time and not focus on the running. Some might not be able to get away with it, right? We look at firefighters. I know it's not anything to do with endurance, but firefighters, when they focus on the breathing, sometimes it works for them, it calms them down, right? They have their oxygen tank. They only have so much air in that tank, and part of their task for their occupational performance is to relax their breathing and reduce their metabolic cost and keep that tank as long as possible, right? To kind of use that as long as possible. And so some have different mental cues. Now it's all about sports psychology too, what you can focus on to really clear your mind of everything else that's going on around you. So it is huge and huge and multifactorial approach to the psychology behind it. So obviously not my area, but there's so many skills training you can do. I'm sure you do some on your own too.
No, and it's interesting too that especially with the tactical athletes like, police officers, firefighters, military even, because, just like an endurance athlete or a team sport athlete, they're out there trying to maximize their performance and efficiency and economy too. So it's kind of interesting that they've done research with them too, in terms of like cueing and how it best maximizes their performance on the job.
Yeah. And I think that'll be something that really, I don't want to say blows up, but more research will be in that within the next few years, because I know that especially with military, sports psychology is becoming a huge factor within on-base training.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we'll see more from that.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of the way that it seems like sports science, or I don't want to say sports science research, but almost like performance, especially as you start moving up in levels, like as you get closer and closer to being like an elite amateur or even like a professional, it's not so much the physical characteristics that separates people. It's more so the psychology and what you're thinking about, like how you react to stressors and things that don't go your way.
Yep.
And the cueing kind of ties in with that. That's almost like one of those extra little percentages that you can gain over someone else if they're matched in terms of VO2 max and lactate threshold and running economy, or just efficiency and economy in general, not necessarily just running. But yeah, if you can be smarter in how you cue yourself and what you focus on, that's just an extra percent advantage you're going to have over the person next to you if they're, floundering around focusing on their gait at mile 23 of a marathon. So yeah, interesting. I think there's a lot of good stuff here for not only like the self-coached athlete, because we see a lot of that with endurance athletes, but yeah, also coaches in general who are working with athletes. Because I've seen a lot of different approaches to cueing with coaches too, and it is really common with runners to focus on like their arm carry, or at least for coaches to tell them to focus on how they're carrying their arms, or like where their head position is at, what they're doing with their feet, and like what their cadence is like. But kind of seems like if you're focusing on performance, focusing on like your cadence might not be the best thing.
Well, I think I think it's a thing that, if you think that something is wrong with your gait and you're practicing or something like that, maybe think about it. But if you're going for a PR or you're in a race or something like that, then just completely cut it out.
Yep. Yeah. No, cool. Is there anything else interesting that you guys have seen in the literature as it relates to cueing, or do you feel like we've kind of touched on all the major take homes?
I think one of the big things that me and Connor want to get into now is the frequency of cueing. How much is too much? Is there an overload? Do I need to give it every other cue like we gave? We don't know. That's, a question to still be answered. And maybe how the wording is, because saying a certain word may trigger a certain thing in the athlete's brain to interpret it a different way. So with cues, less is more, right? You don't want to give this crazy long sentence, paragraph of cues and all this stuff, and 3 cues and feedbacks, and to really screw somebody up, teach them to move. It's minimal, right? So wording, is a big thing, and frequency, I think, for myself, what we were headed in. And so, Connor, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Because I think the biggest thing is the whole premise of why an external cue is better than an internal cue is because it doesn't overstimulate the individual.
Yeah.
It allows the autonomic processes to actually just occur.
Right.
And I think that's another thing is like if you're cueing an athlete constantly, it doesn't matter what the cue is, you're still overstimulating them. So it's like Dr. Snarr said, finding where that optimal range is. And I mean, I'm sure it'll vary from population to population or, novice and intermediate somewhere in there. But I think that's something that definitely needs to be looked at.
Yeah. So speaking of things that need to be looked at, do you guys have, I know Connor, you said you're going to get a job first potentially before moving on and getting your PhD. But like Ron, do you have any more plans of following up with this kind of research or doing anything else with attentional focus and cueing?
Oh, for sure. So this part that we did just now was kind of another part that I had done a study prior to where we could see weights and where we could not see weights and look at the difference, right? To see if somebody could lift more when they couldn't see the weight or vice versa, whatever the results came out to be. And so the next step would be, right, you can't see the weight. Is it psychological? Are we having some sort of interruption with, ooh, that's a lot of weight. Can I lift this? Now I'm trying to think of a cue, but I want to try and focus on exerting as much force as possible and using all the muscle. So I think there's a combination of factors that we can build off of here, using different exercises, using different loads and intensities. We use pretty high load, 85%, but does that change as we get lighter, right? As we get heavier, what happens there? Does it really matter at a given intensity? So if we're at near max, I could tell you whatever you want, that's not going to matter. You're going to lift as hard as you can that load. So probably lighter loads and different exercises and some sort of psychological processes. I don't remember the study that Connor would probably remember, the study we came up with about the negative emotion states and what you're thinking about. So
okay.
Do you remember what that was, Connor?
Yeah, you basically, I don't think we came up with a task, but what he basically wants to do is have a participant come in and just put them in a terrible mindset and just like thinking about, just not necessarily trauma, but just a bad day in their head. And so where they're in a bad mood because, it's the phenomenon, people that exercise half the time when you're in a super bad mood, that's when you have your best workouts.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, does that mindset alter the physiological variables?
Yeah. Like, is it better to be pissed off racing or like super happy and filled with gratitude and love? And
because that's what it was. When you're coming into the gym, you're not going to be in there saying, all right, let me press the barbell to the ceiling. Let me press the barbell to the ceiling every time. Nobody thinks about that stuff when they're working out. They think about their day, they think about what went on. They're thinking about, what they're going to do that night. So does the mood state affect performance as well? Like, I got up in a terrible mood today. I don't want to do this. How does that affect performance?
Okay. Yeah. So not only like just being pissed off, but like if you're feeling like low on motivation or energy or sad. Yeah.
Right. Or good. It's like the way put you in a happy mood somehow, show you a puppy. I don't know, something. And make you lift.
Yeah. I'd be interested to see how you go about like trying to piss people off, if that's one of the ways you're trying to go about it, and like how you get that past the IRB, like depending on how you do it.
Yeah. Well, that's what we talked about. I mean, it's kind of thing you almost have to have, a psychologist or a therapist or somebody on staff.
Bring up like past traumas and be like, all right, take off.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Just failed a test. Your girlfriend broke up with you. Lift. Go.
Yeah. Tell me about your last trauma. Let's dive into that. Yeah, cool. No, that's super interesting. Yeah, lots of interesting ways you can diverge off of this, and lots of stuff that's super, super practical and relevant though for just athletes in general, because our mood and what we're focusing on and what we're thinking about just changes and fluctuates so often that it's super relevant to coaches and athletes in general. So yeah, cool. I think there's lots and lots of good stuff here. Do you guys have anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap things up? Cool.
I think we covered a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Ron, what are some good ways of keeping up with you if people have any questions or just want to follow what you're doing?
Yeah, so I have my Instagram page at Scientist with a Board. It's always a good one where I break all the
Yep.
myths of fitness. That's always fun.
Yep.
Twitter, Snarr Fitness, and then you can find me on ResearchGate and all that stuff, so you can follow publishings and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, cool. How's Scientists with a Board going? I know it looks like it's growing, right? Getting more complex with it, doing some more things.
It's getting more. I gotta get some more people. I need some more ideas.
I was gonna say, yeah, if you're doing like one or two, like one of those a day or one every other day, there's a lot of things you gotta be like constantly trying to like miss the bus. So
I'm gonna slow down. Luckily, social media itself gives me a lot of ammunition. So.
Yeah. I was gonna say, all you gotta do is follow some Instagram pages. I'm sure.
Pages.
Yeah, you'll get plenty of ideas.
I might have to go to small videos. It looks like that's the route everybody takes.
Ooh, yeah. And you're starting to do some Instagram stories now, I saw, which is, I guess, what a lot of people are interested in.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, cool. All right, what about you, Connor? What are some
probably Twitter would be I use Twitter more than any other social media, but it's just Connor_Collum. I have a LinkedIn page if you're curious about, academic stuff, but either or.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll be sure to link those into the show notes below. Yeah, definitely go give Scientists with a Board a follow. It's probably one of my favorite Instagram pages now. Yeah, cool. All right, well, yeah, thanks to both of you guys for joining me today. Lots of good stuff. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. Appreciate it. Of
course. All right, take care. Cheers. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you're listening to us on iTunes and you have a free moment, go ahead and leave us a review. Those reviews are very much appreciated. And if you know of anyone who would be interested in following along to our podcast, please be sure to share this episode with them and let them know to subscribe.